A very good evening, Zimbabwe. Welcome to LiveTalk. We are coming to you live from Studio 7 at the Voice of America in Washington this Friday, December the 16th, 2022. I'm your host, Marvelous Mhlanganyahuye. And tonight on LiveTalk, we are talking about the just-ended U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit, which was held in Washington, D.C. Some African leaders who are attending the summit are expecting to reap benefits from the gathering, where lucrative deals were signed with the U.S. government and other stakeholders. Zimbabwe's President Emmerson Mnangagwa was not invited to the summit. It's unclear on what Zimbabwe will benefit from the summit following the exclusion of President Emmerson Mnangagwa from the three-day event. He was represented by Foreign Affairs Minister Frederick Shava. African Union Chairperson Macky Sall of Senegal urged President Biden to remove targeted sanctions imposed on ZANU-PF officials. Shava also castigated U.S. sanctions and for excluding Mnangagwa, but America has not yet responded to their remarks. Nasi tiri kutarisa nyaya yemusangano we-US Africa Summit uyo wakapera muguta reWashington DC nezuro. Mutungamiri wesangano reAfrican Union vaMacky Sall nezuro vakakumbira hurumende yeAmerica kuti ibvise zvirango zveupfumi zvakatemerwa mamwe makurukota ehurumende nevanodyidzana nehurumende. Mutungamiri weAmerica akatsinhira kuti nyika yeAmerica iri kutarisira kudyidzana nenyika dzemuAfrica zvakasimba, uye vakati kubudirira kweAfrica kubudirirawo kuAmerica. Regai tinzwe zvavakataura pamusangano uyu. Let's now take a listen to what President Biden said at the summit.
When Africa succeeds, the United States succeeds. Quite frankly, the whole world succeeds as well. Now, 8 years later, the world has undergone a great many changes. We're still grappling with the deadly pandemic, facing down war and instability, addressing economic challenges with global impact, fighting rising food prices, tackling the impacts of climate change. And each of these crises has only heightened the vital role African nations and peoples play to address the global challenges that drive our global progress. We can't solve any of these challenges without African leadership at the table. And I'm not trying to be nice, that's a fact. African ideas and innovation helping to shape the solutions, and African population contributing to every step.
Vachitaurawo pamusangano uyu munyori mukuru wehurumende yeAmerica vaAntony Blinken vakati America ichange ichishanda neAfrica pasina kumanikidzana. The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken had this to say.
The reality is that the United States and African nations cannot deliver on any of the fundamental aspirations of our people. We can't solve any of the big challenges that we face if we don't work together. So our approach is about what America can do with African nations and people, not for them. And that's what this summit, the U.S. African Leaders Summit, has really been all about. We took full advantage of having so many leaders from African governments, businesses, civil society here in Washington to strengthen these partnerships, as was demonstrated, I think, by the robust engagement from President Biden, Vice President Harris, and a large number of our cabinet secretaries throughout the course of the week. And as you've heard, we're putting considerable new resources toward advancing our shared priorities, $55 billion over the next 3 years alone. So let me just take a minute to sum up and highlight a few of those key areas that have come out of the summit. But let me start by saying the bottom line is this. We made significant, tangible progress across every one of our priorities this week, building on the momentum that we've generated over the past 2 years. We committed to ensuring African countries have a prominent seat at the table, wherever consequential decisions are being made, consequential issues discussed. We delivered on that. At the United Nations General Assembly in September, you heard President Biden express support for adding a permanent member from Africa to the UN Security Council. And this week, the President announced support for the African Union to join the G20 as a permanent member. In our strategy, we also committed to expanding broad-based economic opportunity in Africa, in part by mobilizing the unmatched power of the American private sector.
African Union Chairperson Macky Sall called on the Biden administration to lift the targeted sanctions imposed on ZANU-PF. Let's hear more.
This is a renewed commitment to open for dialogue and partnership, for strong international relations. In this spirit, Africa calls for the lifting of sanctions which continue to affect the Zimbabwean people. Zimbabwe has been sanctioned since Mugabe's time, and I think it's time to lift these sanctions so that the Zimbabwe people can continue to fight efficiently against underdevelopment and poverty.
We were hearing there a translation of the speech that was made by the AU chairperson, and President Joe Biden enumerated billions of dollars worth of U.S. investments in Africa, both public and private. In remarks to the Africa leaders and the continent's business community at a three-day summit, VOA White House correspondent Anita Powell reports from the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit in Washington, D.C.
U.S. President Joe Biden capped his three-day summit of African leaders by hinting that he may come visit.
As I told some of you, you invited me to your countries. I said, be careful what you wish for, because I may show up. The poor relatives always show up. The wealthy ones never show up. The poor come and they eat your food, stay longer than they should. Well, I'm looking forward to seeing many of you in your home countries.
It's a striking joke from the leader of the world's wealthiest nation, who spent much of Wednesday touting U.S. plans to deliver $55 billion in assistance to a continent struggling with food insecurity, inequality, and a painful legacy of colonialism. But jokes aside, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations told VOA that a presidential trip would have a big impact.
This will be an opportunity for the people of Africa, whatever countries, if the president decides to make such a visit, that they will actually see our commitment to them.
These grand gestures and big promises contrast with the quieter diplomacy happening at the summit of 50 African leaders, which included meetings between Secretary of State Antony Blinken and leaders of Ethiopia and Congo, both countries with active conflicts, and with stable West African allies Senegal and Southern African energy giant Angola. Analysts say the U.S. is trying to work with a range of African partners, regardless of their track records, on issues where they can find common ground.
I think what Washington is trying to do is diversify its relationships on the continent and not make them dependent on any one leader or any one group of countries, because what we have seen is these countries remain fragile, and a strategic partner today could be engulfed in civil war tomorrow.
Biden also invited the leaders of Congo, Gabon, Liberia, Madagascar, Nigeria, and Sierra Leone to a private meeting on Wednesday, where they discussed their upcoming elections during what the White House says is a critical time for democracy globally. Publicly, Biden affirmed support for more African representation on the G20 and the UN Security Council, while not ignoring their shortfalls.
As leaders, our people inspire us. They awaken in us the possibilities that are within our grasp, and there's so many possibilities if we work together. They tell us hard truths that we need to hear, and sometimes we have trouble listening. They challenge us to live up to the values enshrined in so many of our founding documents, and to be worthy of the responsibility given to us by that sacred trust.
That particular message falls on some old years. Cameroon's Paul Biya is 89. Republic of Congo's Denis Sassou Nguesso is 79, as is Nigeria's Muhammadu Buhari. Many of these men, and all but one African head of state is male, were born well before their countries gained independence, on a continent where the median age is just 18. What will they take back to their homelands, other than full pockets and warm memories? Anita Powell, VOA News, Washington.
Zimbabwe's president was not invited at the meeting due to alleged gross human rights abuses in Zimbabwe. Commenting on the call by the African Union chairperson for the lifting of the targeted sanctions, Information Secretary Nick Mangwana had this to say.
tinoti Africa inoramba ichitaura nguva nenguva musi nenguva kuti zvirango hazvina kodzero, zvirango zvakatemerera Zimbabwe ngazvibviswe. Tinotarisa kuti panenge pakaita gungano rinoita se-US Africa Leaders Summit, ngavateerewo kutaura kweAfrica. Zimbabwe yakataura, SADC ikataura, Africa yese yataura kuburikidza nachairman wayo. Saka kungangova kusindimara nemwoyo mukukutu kuti munhu asanzwa zvinenge zvichitaura zvizvarwa zveAfrica zvese.
Asika America nedzimwewo nyika dziri kuti pane zviga zvinofanira kugadziriswa neZimbabwe kuti zvirango izvi zvibviswe. Sei hurumende yeZimbabwe isiri kugadzirisa zviga izvi?
Hurumende yeZimbabwe nevana veZimbabwe vakapiwa kuzvitonga kuzere gore ra1980. Zvinoreva kuti kuzvitonga kuzere kunoreva kuti hautemerwe chiga noumwe munhu, hamutemerwe zviga neimwe nyika, because hamusi pasi pedzimwe nyika, muri pakusi pekuzvitonga kuzere. Saka kuna nyika ine kodzero yokutemera Zimbabwe chiga chipi nechipi zvacho, chingava chemuhlobo upi kana mutovo upi. Nokuti tikatarisa tichidzokera kumashure mugore ra2008 pane vakaidza kuti zviitwe kuburikidza neUnited Nations. Zvinova ndo mashandisirwo anoitwa nyaya dzacho kana pasvika pakuti pane nyika yacheyama pfuura kune dzimwe. Zvakaenda kuUnited Nations, United Nations ikazviramba, ikaona kuti hapana kodzero kuti Zimbabwe iiswe pasi pezvirango zveupfumi, asi vakaenderera mberi vachiisa Zimbabwe pasi pezvirango zveupfumi kunze kweUnited Nations, zvinova zviri pamurawo wenyika dzepasi rose. Saka nekudaro zvirango izvi hazvisi pamutemo, zvirango izvi ndezveutsinye, zvirango izvi hazvibatsiri. Zimbabwe inoita zvinhu maererano nebumbiro rayo remutemo rinonzi constitution, kwete nezvinotaura dzimwe nyika. Gore rino tikateerera zvaita America seZimbabwe toita zvinoda America, mangwana toteerera zvinoda China, kuswera mangwana toteerera zvinoda South Africa, kuti rinotevera toteerera zvinoda kana kuti Russia. Ko isu sezvizvarwa zveZimbabwe tichazoita riine zvatinoda?
We were hearing there from Information Permanent Representative in Zimbabwe, Mr. Nick Mangwana. For those that have just joined us, please note that we are streaming live on all our Facebook pages, VOA Shona, VOA Studio 7, and VOA Ndebele. We're also live on YouTube, VOA Zimbabwe. We are now joined, we are lucky today, we have an in-studio guest. We have Mr. Tawanda Dzokora of the Citizens Coalition for Change. And I understand on the phone we have Regis Charumbira of ZANU-PF. But I'll start with my in-studio guest, Mr. Tawanda Dzokora. Welcome to the program, Mr. Dzokora.
Thank you, Tete Marvelous. Makadi muri Zimbabwe yakateerera.
Aiwa, vadzokora maamuri kunzwa zvanga zviri kutaurwa navamangwana vehurumende panyaya yezvirango zviri kunzi nasachigaro veAfrican Union zvibviswe munyika. Munoti chini nyaya iyi?
Zvirango zvipi zviri kutaurwa navamangwana? President Chamisa, mukuru we-CCC, akatotaura iye kuti vada kuti masanctions aende. Saka toda kutaura kuti masanctions ari kutaurwa apa ndeapi. Kana ari masanctions akapiwa vanhu akaita sevana vaMnangagwa naivo vaMnangagwa, anokanganisa chii kuenderera mberi kwenyika yeZimbabwe. Isu tozviziva kuti hakuna masanctions ariko ari kukanganisa Zimbabwe, nekuti America yacho yavanoti ndio inopa masanctions, ndio inopa mari yakawandisa kupfuura China, kupfuura Russia. Hakuna nyika iri kubatsira Zimbabwe kupfuura America. Makazviona muCovid takapiwa mamillions. Iko zvino chaizvo makaona kuembassy yeZimbabwe ambassador achitaura kuti vamabusiness muZimbabwe huyai tishande pamwe chete, tokupai mari moita mabusiness, mounza zvinhu zvenyu kuAmerica muchikozvitengesera kuAmerica. Saka masanctions avari kutaura ipapa ndeapi? Kutadza kuuya kwavaMnangagwa kana kuti kwemwana wavo ari kuita basa rekutengesa goridhe renyika akusiriko kunotadza kuenda kuti nyika yedu ienderere mberi.
Mobata makadaro regai tibva tachingamidza vaRegis Charumbira makadi. Halo vaCharumbira, muri kutinzwa here? Ehe, motipawo pfungwa dzenyu panyaya iyi yezvatakaona zvichiitika iko kuno kuAmerica, kwanga kuine musangano mukuru we-US Africa Leaders Summit uchangobva kupera, uyezve takaona sachigaro vesangano reAfrican Union vachiti zvirango zvibviswe. Imi munoti chii sebato reZANU-PF?
Ndinotenda muri kundiwa zvakanaka.
Taura yenyu.
Okay, ndinotenda muri kundiwa zvakanaka. I think patinofana kuziva semhuri yezimbabwe ndechekuti nyika yeAmerica inyika inoshandisa mazimonic tendencies, inyika iyo yakada kuzviisa pamusoro pedzimwe nyika dzese inonzi super power, yokuzvipa self-acclaimed super power. Saka inyika yekuti painoinvita dzimwe nyika inodecide who to invite and later on not who to invite. Zimbabwe yakanyorerwa tsamba yainvitwa kuti iuye kuthis UN summit, and then now UN summit yakuda kusvika, America yakuda kutamba with holding our tail kuti Zimbabwe haishauyi. It is to not bow down to America chachose, because takahwina nyika yedu we sovereign nation, tisabuilda nyika yedu wedza nemafriends asiri America. Zvinhu zviri kufamba kuno kuZimbabwe ndokwandiri right now. Hakuna macomplaints. Economy iri kubuildika slowly because of where we came from. Chakasafa nenyaya yemasanctions ari kukonzerwa naiye Biden. Saka ichi cheZimbabwe tinoziva masanctions aya akazokumbidzwa neuyu unondichamisa anonzi kwandira mukurukuru wetriple C yakaiswa Chokora. Ndiye akaenda kunokumbira masanctions. Nhasi unochamisa uri kunzi uri kuclaima kuti ndakuti masanctions ngaabve. Saka kana iye chamisa atikwanisa kuti masanctions aabe, inodii kubvisa masanctions acho America. Ndoko munoona kuti triple C yacho inofanira kuti inge ichiziva nawo kuti America ichii chinonzi America. Haisi nyika yekuti munofunga kuti munombotaura naye muchipiwa madonations neAmerica mofunga kuti iyo ichakuteererai. Kana ichikuteererai chamisa achiteererwa naBiden neUSA ngaichidzisa masanctions America, nokuti chamisa uya wakaenda kunomakumbira wati ngaabvisiwe. Muchaona kuti haimbomabvisi America masanctions iwawo. Ende tichiona weZimbabwe ticharamba tichibuilda nyika yedu, tichihwina maelection edu, tichinofa nyika yedu, triple C ichingobhega masanctions, tichingobuilda nyika yedu. Ndatenda.
Thank you so much there, Mr. Charumbira. Mr. Jokora, you were hearing what Regis Charumbira of ZANU-PF is saying and alleging that your own CCC party leader, that he should now go ahead and ask President Biden to remove the sanctions. What's your take?
It's not about President Chamisa, it's not about me, it's about Zimbabwe doing what it must do. They must respect human rights in Zimbabwe, and they must enact electoral reforms. Those are very simple demands that America is putting across. If they can do that, the sanctions will go. President Chamisa can talk. Remember in 2008, President Tsvangirai was prime minister. He could not get the sanctions removed because it's not up to anyone. It's up to the Zimbabwean government. Emmerson Mnangagwa and ZANU-PF know exactly what they need to do. They should stop killing people. We know the death of Mr. Tuesday. He was murdered. More Blessing Ali, and now we have Mr. Job Scala, who has been in jail for more than 5 months. Those are the things that attract sanctions. If they stop abusing citizens, if they stop abusing Zimbabweans, then the sanctions will go.
Maybe, stay with your thoughts right there. Let me go back to Mr. Charumbira. Mr. Charumbira, you're hearing what Mr. Tawanda Jokora of the CCC is saying. He's saying that, there are certain issues that have to be addressed, especially the human rights abuses in Zimbabwe and the incarceration of some members of the CCC. What's your take? Mr. Charumbira, I'm not sure if I still have you on the line. No. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, you have me on the line. Issue says ZANU-PF government, the party leader government, we will not bow down to America, how to rule our country. That's how we are a sovereign country, we are an independent nation. We can also sit up a UN. Nendawa yekuti takagwatswa Stonga, America haigoni kuuya kudictator how Zimbabwe should run its affairs. Kana munhu akatadza nokuti ari kubhilonga kuCCC kana kuMDC, ngaende kujere, anotonga, anopika. Hazvina basa nokuti Job Scala kana ndichamisa kana ndibiti kana kuti ndidzokora. Ukatadza uri muno munyika, ukabatwa namakoti kuti iwe uri kukonzera mhirizhonga, uri kuti government ngaibvisiwe chinokurova neshamhino munyu, unoenda kujere, and that is not a problem. Internationally, unongosunga ke uri kuAmerica kwauri dzokora. Ukada kubvisa kuti unfit Biden iwewe, unoenda newewe kuprison. Unosunga ugochajiwa, ugopika uriko. Saka Job Scala, for example, anofana kupika wakura yake ingapuwa nekoti yakwana. Nokuti Job Scala wakachitaura many times. Achidenigrate government yeZimbabwe. Listen, vanhu veCCC nana Jokora. You continue to do that as if this is not sanctions also. You continue to do that as it is not the spice also. And it can be done sanctions, typical jobs, you know what? Rapu part of the court.
Vacharumbira regai tikubatei muromo ipapo.
Jobs akanochadzwa nekoti akapiwa 100 years. Toda kuona kuti America itaramba yakasanctions iri pa 100 years. Ndakauranga Chamisa kana Chamisa ane simba ngaanobudisa jobs kala. Chamisa akarega jobs kala haana kufana kana kubatsira choose ra jobs kala asunga. Immense system nozviziva. Those the reason why vamwe venyu vakadefecta vakauya kubvambire. Nenyaya yekuti vakaona kuti Chamisa iri service. Chero munhu akazi asunga haakwanisi kana kubatsira kana kuita sei. Because all what he cares about is feeding his belly and his own children. He wants to get a problem. Chamisa ambovaka kubatsira. But when you get a problem, Zambia is not kubatsira. Why? Because if you say Zambia to Shanda is the family. You understand? So that's why I'm keeping really kana munaka. Not saying no Zimbabwe. So I jobs kala or whoever. Kana koti ikambatsa kuti munhu uyu unokodzera kuti aende kunopika munhu ine yechera jobs kala aende kunopika.
Batai makadaro vacharumbira apo zvamanga makutaura zvinogona kugodorowo mwoyo wehama dzavana jobs kala asi regai tiende kuna vadzokora. You heard what Mr. Charumbira was saying. What's your take?
Munotonzwa kudada kwevanhu veZANU-PF vari kutaura kuti jobs kala ngaapike. Jobs kala haasati atombopikiswa ari paremand iko zvino anofanira kunge achitongwa ari kunze. It's his constitutional right to get bail. You know, and we have people that have committed the same crime that is alleged Jobs Kala to have committed. We have a person that threatened President Chamisa in Masvingo, who said President Chamisa should be killed. And we also have people that attempted the life of President Chamisa, that almost assassinated President Chamisa in Masvingo, in Mutare. Those people are out. The people that killed Mo Blessing Ali are out. The people that murdered Mr. Tuesday in Mlawayo, that murdered Bongeni Nuve in Kwekwe, they are out. Those people should be in jail right now. But we have Jobs Kala, you know, being kept in jail without being given his constitutional right, you know, of bail, simply because he made some utterances that are not even attributable to what Mr. Charumbira is saying. And I also want to go back to the issue of sanctions and what the chairperson for AU said. You know, there is nothing wrong in calling for the removal of sanctions. You know, but for AU and SADC and all the other leaders that are calling for the sanctions removal, to call for their removal without calling out ZANU-PF and Emerson Mnangagwa, it's morally wrong. You know, they have to look at what the Zimbabwean people are going through. Zimbabweans are suffering because of the looting, because of the corruption. Zimbabwe is where it is today, not because of sanctions, but because of the massive looting. Zimbabweans are being killed. I've told you the number of people that have been killed by ZANU-PF. So it is the Zimbabwean people that are suffering right now under ZANU-PF. So we want these leaders, while they are calling for the removal of sanctions, to also, you know, tell the truth to ZANU-PF about what it is doing. It must stop killing Zimbabweans. It must stop the war that it has declared on the Zimbabwean citizens. And of course, if then the sanctions are going to go, we will all jubilate. But we cannot have a situation where ZANU-PF continues to kill people, continues to arrest arbitrary citizens who would not have committed any crime. We know why they are doing this. We know why they are declaring war on the citizens. They are afraid of losing the elections in 2023. So they are just intimidating people. They want to spread harvest of fear. They know that they don't stand a chance against President Chamisa. In fact, ZANU-PF is saying goodbye to its people. You saw them giving each other 500,000, 200,000. It's testimony that ZANU-PF is already knows that they have lost the 2023 election. Vakutobira kuenda.
Tiri ipapo vadzokora vamwe vangada kubvunzawo kuti imi sebato reCCC makamboedza here kuti mukwidze nyaya iyi ku-AU yekutarisa zvimwe zvamataura izvi kuti vasati vakumbira kuti zvirango zvibviswe vanofanira kutarisa izvi neizvi neizvi.
discussions have been done by the South African government, by the AU, by SADC. President Chamisa has been to South Africa. You heard him talk about that. He doesn't want sanctions as much as everyone else. And he has made that clear to SADC and to AU. But he has also made it clear that he does not want any more blood by ZANU-PF anymore. He does not want citizens to continue being arrested arbitrarily. And he has asked AU to intervene. He has asked SADC to intervene on behalf of the people of Zimbabwe. We are just calling upon SADC and AU to stand with the citizens, to stand with the people of Zimbabwe. It's high time they tell each other the truth, these leaders. They are seeing the human rights abuses that are rampant in Zimbabwe. They are also seeing the corruption, the looting that is going on, that has brought our country to its knees. And they choose to turn a blind eye on that and come after the citizens of Zimbabwe and talk about sanctions. Let's talk about sanctions, and let's also talk about the issue of human rights in Zimbabwe.
Thank you, Mr. Jokora. It is now time to hear from our callers, the stakeholders of the show, and some of the people that are live streaming with us. Let me read a few comments from VOH Tona. Veronica Jokora saying, Mukanya Rambai Makajanya. So she's watching you. And then there's Munyaradzi Kahaira Arkuti. Is Zimbabwe on sanctions? Someone please explain to me. Vanoti Anzima individual sanctions. And then Edna Madondo Anzi Yatova violence. Aiwaregaiti mbodzokera kuna vacharumbira timbova pamukana vacharumbira motipo mazwi enyu ekutsanangura kuti pari zvino takatarisa iwo musangano uyu we-US Africa Leaders Summit mungati wabatsira sei Zimbabwe?
Musangano we-US Africa Leaders Summit hauna zvaunonyatsokubatsira kuZimbabwe. Because musangano uyu wakanga wakatajetewa president Mnangagwa vakaenda ikoko Joe Biden agowana a chance of talking whatever he wants achiuza president wedu achitaura nyaya dzake dzechokwane dzemahuman rights. Because America is one and first country inoviolate human rights evanhu more than any other country. Vanotoita encroach into other countries vachikonzeresa human rights issues. Saka ichitozvati kutorega kuenda kwakata president whether varega because America yacho yakazorega kuvainvita. But I think it's a blessing in disguise. Because we were not going to let our president going to go to America to listen to an old man who is just going to lash out talking about how a country should be formulated, whereby he is mismanaging his own people. We have got black African Americans who are suffering in Harlem, who are suffering in Brooklyn. They're sleeping on the streets. It doesn't mean that when you're in America, there is everything. But here in Zimbabwe, we are building our country. We are seeing the evidence that the president is doing. So this U.S. Africa Summit did not help us nothing. Maybe other countries, but for us, I think in Zimbabwe, we keep on fighting. And I think we are almost where we are. We will continue to do it, even though who are backing, they continue backing, but the election, like what Jokora was trying to say, the election, for sure, you can try to make your viewers. Zimbabwe is not a CCC affiliated political arena. It is actually ZANU-PF. You can even check the barometers. That ZANU-PF has acquired many supporters defecting from your party, CCC. But I don't understand because
Thank you so much, Mr. Charumbira. If I may just hold you there and just, please, let's be respectful of our leaders, whether it's President Emmerson Mnangagwa or President Joe Biden. Let's just be respectful when we're addressing them. But I'll come back to you. Let's come to you, Mr. Jokora. Manzwa zvataurwa navacharumbira motipa mazwi enyu kupedzisira.
Yes, muri kunzwa matauriro avari kuita vacharumbira kuti havatorina kana any respect, but chandoda kutaura zvangu panyaya yesummit iri kuitwa iyi ndo zviri kuitika kumuzimbabwe kuti tiri kupfuurwa nezvinhu zvakanaka zvinofanira kunge zvichiita kuti nyika yedu ibudirire. Zvatinokwanisa kutongoita ipapa ndezvekuti ZANU-PF iri kutaura iyo kuti vari kuita re-engagement process. and vanenge vachinyepa vachiti they've been allowed, but they haven't been allowed.
Thank you, Mr. Jokora. Unfortunately, we don't have any extra time, as in soccer. I'm Marvelous Mhlanganyahuye in Washington, D.C., saying have a very good evening. And thank you to Mr. Charumbira, as well as you, Mr. Jokora, who was an in-studio guest, and you, the listeners who were live streaming and listening to us.